The most immediate affect of 66, directed by Klahr and released in 2015, is perplexing to try and describe. To be exact, it is an anthology of 12 short films, all composed of the same visual style in mind, a cut-and-paste collage of seemingly 1960s-era comic book art, vivid illustrations depicting a utopic pop-materialist modernism. There appears to be few, if any, major precedents for Klahr's feature from cinema history, which grants it an inherently unique beauty all its own. What feels like a consistency between the short films, aside from their shared method of construction, is something indescribably ominous. It both jeers at this once-established mode of depicting, perceiving modern life, and despairs in its passing, conjuring a time of shameless luxury and vigorous cupidity. A time when the disappearance of bodily shame still shared life with a lack of guilt over material excess. Capitalist consumption, as though it were an extension of or comparable to sexual freedom, could be considered soulfully gratifying and empowering, not superficial emptiness and denial. I love the potent imagination on display, the creativity with which director Klahr extrapolates surreal yet archetypal vignettes out of comic illustrations, enabling a sensation reminiscent of that era's pop art. The commercial idealism of an advertising product, as comic books were industrially considered in those days, can be a dimension of valid artistic beauty in and of itself. Beauty may not be the right word, perhaps a better word is insight. The introspectively ironic tendencies of pop art and artists is worth asterisking, because while I am in no way certain as to whether Klahr saw himself as a successor or equivalent of mid-20th century visual pop artists, I am rather convinced that Klahr does see something sublime within that era's lost romanticized modernist pop aesthetic. Certainly one of the most fascinating animated feature films of the 2010s, and even of this entire 21st century thus far. I shall now share Lewis Klahr's brief biography as provided by the website of the Tate Modern, because I found it very insightful and interesting, and available. Lewis Klahr, born 1956, United States, is a Los Angeles-based experimental filmmaker. He is known for his uniquely idiosyncratic films, which use found images and sound to explore identity, sexuality, memory, and history. Since creating his first film in 1977, his body of work has come to encompass a number of short digital and analog stop-motion collages, including 2 feature-length films. Creating a dialogue between cut-and-paste collage, underground and experimental film traditions, and the art world, Klahr digs into the heart of Americana, I think that's meant to be, presenting a counter-pop history of sorts. Klahr's work has won numerous film awards and was acquired for the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art, New York. I decided that I shall also share their description of 66 itself, which I quite like, partially because I feel it validates what I have already written. Working from his personal archive of found print and sound materials, Lewis Klahr has developed a significant body of analog and digital stop-motion collage films over the last 40 years. Structured into 12 chapters, 66 brings together a number of short works produced since 2002 into a filmic anthology that foregrounds the many visual and oral motifs, obsessions, and thematic threads that run through his oeuvre. The title itself refers to one such motif, the number 66, which is always somehow present in the film, whether through imagery and dialogue drawn from the American energy company Phillips 66 and a television series Route 66, or through references to the year 1966. This provides a general temporal context for much of the pop art, architecture, and advertising material from which the film is composed. Ranging from 3 minutes to over 20 minutes in length, the film's 12 chapters comprise a elliptical narrative that takes on the melancholic, nostalgic, and poetic characteristics of its composite short films, with titles such as Erigene's Daughter, Leif, Helen of Tea, Saturn's Diary, Mercury and Ichor. These works invite as well as complicate attempts to read the work through the lens of Greek mythology. With central characters and backdrops culled from a wide array of genres including comic books, sunshine noir, literature, Portuguese photo novels, and architectural magazines, 66 offers a highly textured, dreamlike vision of the iconography of post-war America. I've also come across an interview with Klahr, conducted by one Jordan Cronk, discussing this film as well as his career in general. I have read this interview and compiled the most interesting information as I saw it. Some great insight was provided, I think, by Cronk immediately in the interview's foreword. He notes that Klahr prefers to refer to this film as an act of stop-motion collage in order to distinguish it from more traditional animation methods. He names the film's sourced illustrations as originating not just comic books, but newspaper advertising, sketches in pulp novels, and of course, pop art era artifacts. I quote this forward directly now. These themes of aging and identity become personified by a handful of figures who materialize in various configurations across the film's most ambitious chapters, which, by the conclusion of the film, have accumulated into a sort of metropolitan melodrama. By placing his day-glow dames and dapper gents against a stark landscape of mid-century modernist architecture and arranging them in tarty-like configurations within the frame, Klahr enhances the sense of solitude and ennui. I never know how to pronounce that word, excuse me everyone, which permeates a great deal of the genre cinema with which he is so enamored. The eponymous heroine of Helen of T is a former New York party girl whose younger days are set in stark relief in the film's second half when, now suddenly older and living in Los Angeles, she must reluctantly resign herself to the exigencies of aging. The middle-aged scientist at the center of Lef, the film's final climactic moment, is able to revert back to his youth after being injected with a mysterious serum. Nothing, however, can reverse the fortunes of his female counterpart, whose fate is summoned by the echoing refrain of Mahler's 10th Symphony. But now let me take notes from the interview itself. Klahr states, "I knew I wanted 12 films or chapters to suggest the months of the year 1966. Then, I also knew that each individual film would marry Greek mythology with 60s imagery." Klahr was only interested in loosely telling any direct narrative. He appears to prefer the term poetic shape. He also describes the finished edited order of 66's shorts as a cohesive experience, an associational mindscape, a reverie that accumulates, but that's not something I would call a narrative, though narrative is certainly one of its registers. He discusses why he decided upon 1966 as the titular subject. 1966 is a year where much of my relationship to pop culture or aesthetic consumption got set, absorption that still exists for me today. Although there were various challenges, it was a year that was mostly joyous for me. Years are very distinct when you're young, whereas they're not very distinct to me now. Maybe what I miss most and want to recapture from my childhood is the vividness, so I'm choosing the lens of my childhood to deal with adult life and the present. Not that different from a lot of experimental filmmakers actually, especially Stan Brakhage. Well, that's a claim. And on the film's thematic relationship with ancient Greek mythology, it opens it up, and it also connects it to an older tradition of things, but it's not exactly history. It's more like fictions that are useful or long-lasting, elemental. They are competing versions of stories which all contain partial or paradoxical truth. In a sense, everything is true, so there's a great openness and adaptability to these texts. Even though they're thousands of years old, one can still find their particulars applicable in the mid-20th century or now. To describe this film's fascinating and challenging to explain sound design, music is always a big part of my films. For me, it's another collage element. I want the viewer to hear the music, I include the way I'm hearing it, the way the imagery is modifying it. This is often different than the way one would normally listen to or hear this music. The backward music cues make the familiar strange, but I didn't want 66 to just be music-centric. To create the dynamic range in the sense of the everyday which is vital to 66's descriptive power, I needed to use sound effects and voiceover, and the swallowed and re-edited soundtrack to an episode of the 60s TV show Route 66 in Erigene's Daughter. How fortunate that we have such an articulate explanation behind the film's motivation from its creator. Magnificent. If there are a few more things I personally wanted to share in regard to Lewis Klahr's 66, other than sheer admiration and adulation toward its meticulous and inspired means of composition, it would be for me to commend it for containing one of the most peculiar affects of any film in my current memory. Its vague storyline is communicated through one of the most unique clusters of symbols ever arranged. A mostly visual cut-up wherein each sourced image can encapsulate countless words, forming into defined archetypal prisms throughout its unforgettably bewildering, yet astonishingly coherent, runtime. If one has the fortune to be able to view 66, you will be in for a spectacular experience, one of the most unique and impressive works of film art to be released during the 2010s, quite possibly.